Welcome to one of the fastest growing auto racing experiences in America, vintage car racing. From 200-mile-per-hour Formula One cars to the classic beauty of Bugattis, Lotus, Jaguar, Porsche, and Ferraris. It's all on the track at events sanctioned by the Sports Car Vintage Racing Association. Vintage car racing is the ultimate fantasy spectacle. Amateur drivers competing head-to-head in beautiful, iconic racing cars of all makes and models restored to their original racing specifications. It's wheel-to-wheel racing with vintage cars equipped with state-of-the-art safety equipment and full driver protection. Vintage racing calls the major tracks of the United States home. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway, Watkins Glen, Mid-Ohio, Virginia International Raceway, Sebring, and Road America. Vintage racing is at its best with the SVRA, one of the founding organizations of the sport. With hundreds of racing participants divided among 11 designated groups of race cars at each event, SVRA race weekends are spectacles of sight and sound. Round a corner in the paddock, and you'll see cars exactly like the ones driven by such past racing greats as Mario and Michael Andretti, Sam Posey, Parnelli Jones, Carroll Shelby, and Paul Newman, all being prepared to race. This past year, SVRA produced a special one-of-a-kind event at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, a racing pro-am. Former Indy 500 competitors and winners sharing the driving duties with vintage car racers. You won't want to miss it. It's all coming up next on Pursuit of Passions.
Hey, little Cobra, don't you know you're gonna shut 'em down? I took my Cobra down to the track, hitched to the back of my Cadillac. Everyone was there just to
That is the 1964 hit Hey Little Cobra by the Ripcords, a classic song for a vintage car. Hi, I'm Paul Page, and every one of these automobiles were at one time involved with sports car racing, and they all have a history, a documented record of their sporting lives, when, where, and how they fared. But at some time in their first life, all of them eventually stopped racing. They were retired and put away. They became vintage cars. But that was a good thing, because now these cars are back on the track, and vintage car racing is about as much fun as any amateur sports car racer can ever have. Through the auspices of the Sports Car Vintage Racing Association, the vintage car racing spirit is alive and well, and SVRA is sanctioning vintage racing events all over America. But don't take my word for it. Watch this. Tell me that doesn't look like fun? That is vintage car racing. A vintage car race is wheel-to-wheel racing with similar cars of the same era, like pre-1973 Formula cars, or a group of limited-produced sports cars built prior to 1960. All of them restored to their original racing specifications. Let's hear what the racers have to say.
A few of my friends and I got together and said, let's try vintage racing. We went as spectators, thought they were crazy, and we went and tried it. 1989 was the first time I tried it, and I was hooked since then.
These cars are collectible, and they're objects of art, and they're objects of history.
My guess is I feel differently about my car than Dale Earnhardt Jr. feels about his.
I was racing in SCCA, and my husband was restoring collectible cars, and I realized we were going separate directions every weekend. I had a Mustang, he had a Shelby, and we were able to put the two together, and this was the only sport that allowed us to take the show cars and actually race them.
I know I'm not going to win every time, but I would like to have a good race.
Sebring, 12 Hours in 1965. My grandfather drove my father's Corvette, oddly. So I've been around him since I was a little kid.
The thrill of it is the part of the uncertainty. I don't care who you are, okay? I don't care if you're a Formula One driver or whatever. The guy that tells you he's not nervous before a race is lying.
Whether you come here to run as fast as you can and challenge yourself as much as you can, or just to say that you turned a wheel in this historic race car at this historic track, everybody gets something different out of it. That's the beauty of vintage racing. You take it to whatever level you want.
When we come back, we'll visit the racetrack, take a look at some vintage cars, and hear more from the racers. The 2014 SVRA circuit was a year of great racing at some of the most iconic tracks in America. Sebring, Road Atlanta, Mid-Ohio, Sonoma, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and the Circuit of the Americas. The visit to each track, especially Indy, flipped open the history books and dropped a few more stories for the record.
There was this amazing phenomenon. We're staging them outside of Gasoline Alley, where the entrance to go out on the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And literally, better than 50% of the field got tears rolling down their face. Men and women, grown men and women, are crying before they go out because they cannot believe that they're getting a chance to race at Indy. Circuit of the Americas we race at, and you know, that's a big new fancy Formula One track, and that doesn't have the historical effect, but it has the, I can't believe I'm on this track. Watkins Glen for me is unique, but is for a lot of people because that's an iconic track. You know, and now we're doing things at Sonoma and VIR and so many wonderful circuits. I can go on for 18 of them. There's really some very special places we go.
When can you ever shoot a round of golf at the Masters Course in Augusta, or pitch the 9th inning against your friends in Yankee Stadium, or go a couple of sets on center court at Wimbledon? Probably never. But you can do this. Now, with the growing popularity of vintage racing, the actual legendary sports cars of decades past have returned to race the most hallowed racetracks in America.
And these are real, actual, honest-to-God race cars that are prepared as they were back in the day and run right to the ragged edge.
You've read interviews and you've seen Sterling Moss or Jackie Stewart or John Fitch. You've seen these guys describing the track and talking about this race and that race. So when you find yourself at Sebring or Watkins Glen or Lime Rock, and it dawns on you about the second, third time around it that, wow, you know, you're where these guys, these great guys raced.
Every SVRA event schedules testing, practice sessions, qualifying, and 2 races per group. The majority of SVRA races are timed sprints, anywhere from 25 to 30 minutes in length. Sprint races allow every group to preserve the equipment from costly maintenance and repair. For a vast majority of vintage racers, equipment reliability allows them to compete several weekends a year and finish races. The 2015 SVRA season started at the classic home of sports car racing in America, Sebring, Florida.
Vintage racing, which had been popular before we even thought about it, started to emerge at Sebring in the late 70s when the promoter saw an opportunity to bring back a lot of former race cars to parade around Sebring before the 12 Hours of Sebring. It was hugely successful. So by the early 80s, I saw an opportunity to create a club because I felt like it needed some structure and other events. So we created the Southeast Vintage Racing Association in the spring of 1981.
Many of the race cars that made Sebring such a mecca of sports car racing returned decades later in dramatic and hotly contested races at SVRA's Sebring Spring Classic.
It really harkens back to road racing in the 50s and the 60s. We didn't hit each other back then. You gave the guy room. You never blocked.
Last thing we do is pick up a timesheet on the way out to see, well, what kind of time did we get? Did we beat our previous times that we have done?
First car that I raced was lucky enough to be an Aston Martin DB4. Pretty much the James Bond car is arguably one of the prettiest cars in the world. So it's crazy that you're racing like a Da Vinci painting every time that you get into some of the cars.
In 2012, vintage racing got a much-needed jolt when new ownership brought fresh ideas and rejuvenated energy, expanding the reach and the scope of the SVRA.
Well, I've been a member of SVRA since the mid-'80s, and there have been a lot of changes. And I have to say, and this is truly from the heart, Tony has really improved the series.
Vintage racing, cars, always been a car person, and taking all the lessons learned in 30 years in business, I've just been applying them to something that I'm passionate about. We've grown it, and we've tried to consolidate it and make it more valid. We've really tightened down how we inspect the cars. We try to have one hell of a party every Saturday night. What I'm trying to accomplish is to take vintage racing to where it's mentioned in the same breath as these household names like the NHRA or NASCAR, IndyCar, etc.
Coming up, what it takes to become a vintage driver, and later, the SVRA at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Vintage car racing has clearly defined rules and regulations to make the racing fair and equitable. There's no point in a pre-war Indy big car racing against a Super V. However, many of the vintage cars built by manufacturers over the years have consistencies in their specification that makes racing together competitive.
There's a weight class and specification class for tire size and brake size. Some lists are longer than others, depending on how competitive these cars are, you know, how they were raced back then.
The SVRA divides vintage sports cars into 11 groups. They range from small displacement production sports cars to big bore sports cars and sedans, all the way to wings and slicks formula cars. The bottom line is that no matter what car a racer chooses, it will be placed in a group where they can have fun and be competitive.
I've driven in 2, 3, 1, 10, 5, and 6. A Group 10 stock car, you know it's going to stop straight and you can go in deep and really carry some G's, whereas a C1 Corvette, you have to stop way short and then give yourself room on either side of the car because you don't know which direction it's going to go. So each car has their own experience, but they're all fun.
My approach was to right away sign up for a competition driving school course.
To race in sanctioned SVRA events, every racer must have a current competition license. To acquire that license, a racer must have been licensed previously and a graduate of a recognized and accredited road racing school.
I took the Bob Bondurant school and did well. I took the SCCA driving school. I've been to the Skip Barber driving school. I recently took an open wheel school just because.
Once a racer decides to compete in vintage car racing, he or she needs to acquire a race car. Vintage race cars cost anywhere from a few $1,000s to a few $100,000, and usually a few more dollars to make them safety qualified and race ready.
You know, you find a car that you love that looks great. I've always wanted one of these, or I love the look of that, and you find something you can afford and go after.
My dad and I went over and looked at the car, and it was sitting on the side of this guy's house, and it looked pretty disheveled. And so we offered the guy $200 for it, and he said, yeah. But as soon as that engine ran, my brother went running to the Auto Trader, and we bought our second Jaguars. And that's when the disease started.
My very first car when I was 17 was a '68 convertible Shelby Mustang, and I went to school and paid for it by washing dishes 7 nights a week.
I rode my bike to the local used car lot, and I found a '76 Camaro, and I negotiated with the guy, and I purchased the car, but I wasn't able to drive it home, so he had to deliver it to my house.
Okay, if you put 4 brand new Blue Streak your tires on it, put a new fuel cell, and you put a different seat, because I can't sit in the seat, and bring it to the racetrack for me, then I'll buy it. And by the way, I'd like to pay for it $1,000 a month for 12 months. So he sold it to me for $12,000.
As I was finishing college at Colorado State, I had the option of going into a professional lifestyle where I could actually make money, or I could go and join my father and go vintage racing, which I was assured of making no money, although I'd have the opportunity to race with my father. So what kid can't take him up on that?
The SVRA conducts a driver orientation program for licensed drivers that have not competed in vintage events, and for racing school graduates whose goal is vintage licensing.
Room on the right side at the exit of turn 3 so that you can open up the entry and bend the car back to the right.
There's a track orientation program for drivers that have not driven at a particular venue.
The reason that I took the class this weekend is I have not been on Sebring in many years, and it's always best to refresh yourself.
Peter has moved ahead with the times with the technology and learned how to use onboard data to be a better instructor and to teach the driver. You can almost teach a driver without even going to the track, just by looking at his data, and pick up quite a bit.
The SVRA will visit 18 tracks during a racing season. One of the favorites is Watkins Glen. Before the current track was built, the races at the Glen passed through the heart of town and around the local countryside. To honor that tradition, a parade follows the original course through town and country to kick off Vintage Racing Weekends. And one of the most popular races during that weekend is the historic Trans Am, which recaptures the golden days of sports car racing.
We respect the cars. We drive the cars really hard. This is an art object in motion.
Detailed make and model specifications for preparing a vintage car to race can be found on svra.com. Now, they must be followed and applied to make the car race legal, pass tech, and safety inspection.
First and foremost thing is you have to put a really good roll cage in it, because that's safety. And then it's got to have good seat belts. You also have to have a fuel cell in there and a fire system and a kill switch just in case something happens. So, those are the basic requirements.
You design the car around the aptitude of the driver. For a beginning driver, you make a low horsepower engine that's going to run a lot of hours so they can get as much seat time as possible. For a pointy end of the field driver, we're going to build a short hour, high revving motor that gives them the best opportunity to do well.
Those specifications are the heart and soul of vintage racing. Let's take a look at some of the other things Larry Ligas has to do to get one of his Jaguars on the racetrack.
What we're doing is we're aligning the car, and the purpose of this is to make a perfect rectangle around the car. And once you have that, you can make accurate measurements on all four wheels. We're scaling the car. We're doing this for two reasons. One, because SVRA has a weight requirement for this particular car. And the other reason is we want to get the corner weights as close as possible. This is a camber gauge. It's used to measure wheel angle in relation to the ground, and it helps the car handle and corner better.
No question that there is some advantages to excellent car preparation, but you see driver talent come through in 99% of the time in vintage racing.
Next, on Pursuit of Passions, the National Championships and the Indy Pro-Am.
Hey, little Cobra, don't you know you're gonna shut 'em down?
In only its second annual SVRA National Championships, held in Austin, Texas in early November of 2014 at the Circuit of the Americas, SVRA showed how bright the future is for vintage car racing. 600-plus racers and cars from all across America, as well as an international contingent, accepted the challenge to be the best in their class. In its brief existence, the event has unified vintage racing across America by standardizing its rules and regulations. At the National Championships, 5 principles of vintage car preparation rules prevail: proper tires, proper brakes, correct engine displacement, the weight of the overall car, and no modification to the body panels. This strict adherence to original specs places the chance of winning solely on the driver's ability. This Super Bowl pageant of vintage racing awards the coveted gold bell helmet as the championship trophy to 29 sprint race class champions and 14 enduro race champions. The 2014 SVRA National Championships was unique and immensely popular as it put a cap on the season. This is the 1936 Indianapolis 500, held at the birthplace of American auto racing, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It was a record third win for Louis Meyer, and the first time the winner celebrated by drinking the milk. And arguably, the highlight of the 2014 vintage car